6 weeks ago, my 17-year-old niece suffered a major brain hemorrhage on the soccer field. She plays midfield, and she's a fierce competitor. She's been playing varsity soccer since she was a 9th grader at a soccer school. She was raised the youngest of 5, the other 4 boys, and she was a child who, when she fell down, she got right back up. She has this wicked, incredible sense of humor, a mischievous and fetching grin, and she's the apple of her parents' eye and a delight in our family. And she calls my husband Chucklin' Chuck, which is not a nickname he loves, but he loves my niece. So we say it's all good. I'm going to move this closer. We got the call, my parents and I, late at night, and we were at the emergency room in a major city 5 long hours later. Fear and tears and confusion and the unknown and wires and tubes and a ventilator and a shaved head and a major incision that bit its way across what was left of her skull after their doctors removed a good chunk of it to save her life. Thus began, and it still continues today, a season of suffering for my family. And it's one I don't want to say too much about, as we're fairly personal in my family, and this is intensely personal for us. But I share it with you this morning with my church body, because I want you to understand that this teaching comes out of a very fresh and personal experience with loss and sorrow and fear and suffering that swept upon us without warning, as suffering has a tendency to do. And thank you to those of you who have been praying for my niece. It means the world to me and to her family. And I know that you, or many of you, have walked this road in some way, shape, or form before, or that some of you are walking it right now, or that all of you will someday walk this road, because every single one of us will. And I want to talk with you this morning about suffering and the faithfulness of God. We're in this series that Dave kicked off last week. And Dave got us started by reminding us that God is faithful to his promises. He's faithful to his people. And he's faithful to himself. And I want to start where Dave left off and then push our understanding of faithfulness just a bit further. And a lot of what I am going to talk about right now comes from a book by Mark Buchanan that I actually wrote, put the reference in the bottom of your notes if anyone wants to read a little bit more about this. Buchanan reminds us that faithfulness is one of the deepest characteristics of God. It is right up there with God is holy and God is love. At the very center, God is faithful. And I love how Moses puts it in the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. He writes, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commandments." God can be counted on. God will not fail. God does no wrong. He does not change. He is not fickle. He doesn't have bad moods or bad days. God never oversleeps or underperforms. Any promise God makes, he keeps. God never shades the truth. And he's true to his word. Day after day after day, these things are true about God. And one of the most powerful ways, and we just sang about it, and great is thy faithfulness, that God demonstrates his faithfulness to us, his creatures, is through his creation. Have you ever thought about the dailiness of God's faithfulness demonstrated to us in the world around us and in the world inside of us? The sun, it rises every morning. And it sets so beautifully every night. The birds sing, the grass, no matter how bad it looked after that winter, it greens. The rain falls, the corn grows, the flowers bloom. Our lungs breathe in oxygen 23,000 times a day. I thought about this when I watched my niece on the respirator. And I realized it is a miracle that I can breathe. Our heart beats 100,000 times a day, 35 million times a year. Our eyes scan and take in 10 to 12 images a second. We have food, we sleep, we rise. This is the faithfulness of God. We swim in it. It is the air we breathe. It is ever present. And so much so that we expect it. We count on it. We take it for granted. To a certain extent, Buchanan argues, and I agree with him. Faithfulness, this attribute of God, this showing up over and over and over again, sometimes bores us. We are like the waiters in a restaurant near the Old Faithful Geyser at Yellowstone. I don't know, Doug, did you see it when you were out there? Doug was just out in California. Did you see it? I see you. I'm looking right at you. No. He's just staring at me. So I guess there's this restaurant near the geyser that has a countdown clock letting the patrons know, the visitors, the tourists, when Old Faithful's about to erupt again. And as the countdown clock gets closer and closer and closer, the tourists rush over to the window, leaving their food on the table to see the miracle of Old Faithful. But the waiters, they can't be bothered. They've seen it over and over again, without fail. Old Faithful always erupts. What's the big deal? Yawn. Right? Now all of you are going to start yawning. I didn't think about Pavlov's dog there. I thought about this, and I thought, I take God's faithfulness for granted all the time. And yet what I'm starting to realize is that the faithfulness of God in creation and the faithfulness of God theologically toward those who have turned toward him in humility and gratitude, the faithfulness of God is everything. I base my life on it. And so I need to start waking up to the absolute majesty, not the boredom, of God's faithfulness. I need to watch for it, recognize it, thank him for it now. Because when in my life the oceans roar and the mountains give way, in all of our lives, when the oceans roar and the mountains give way, because they will, when we suffer, the faithfulness of God is what we hang on to. But we have a problem. We have a problem with God's faithfulness and suffering. Because we don't always understand how those two things go together. And this is where Tim Keller's book on walking with God through pain and suffering has been so helpful to me, and it's also referenced in your notes. Keller asks this question, and I want you to think about this in your own life. He said, is the highest good that we become comfortable and trouble-free, or that we become morally and spiritually great? If our lives do not go as we have planned, it is natural to question the wisdom of God. But our indignation, that sense of how could this happen to me, is greatly magnified by an unexamined premise. That's a belief that we hold, that God, if he exists, exists to make us happy, as we define happiness. See, it used to be that you and I, had we lived 100 or so years ago, would have shared a worldview that says we as God's creatures owe him a certain kind of life, a life of faith and obedience and gratitude. But that worldview has shifted under our feet, and we swim in this other sea, this postmodern Western worldview that says God actually owes us a certain kind of life. A life of comfort and happiness and avoidance of pain and safety. A worldview that tells us that more than anything else, God owes his children happiness. He not only owes it to us, but this in our minds is what it means for God to be faithful. When God is being faithful to us, we are happy. And so, very often in our lives, when suffering comes to us, we see it as a breach in God's faithfulness. We say, how could you, God, allow this to happen to me? And we Western Christians, compared to our brothers and sisters around the world, we are especially undone by suffering. How could God allow this in my life when I'm doing all the right things? I mean, I see people from other parts of the world suffering. They're on television, and I maybe tell myself in my head a little story about maybe they handle suffering better, they deserve to suffer, they're used to suffering. But me, us, how can it be God? Reminds me of Will's violin teacher. I've told you this story before, but it's a stunner. Who, after Will broke his thumb playing baseball, I took him into the little violin teaching room where she was, and I told her he broke his thumb, so he can't play. She said to me, if only you had learned a secret prayer that I know, that I've prayed for my children their whole life, God would not have allowed Will's thumb to be broken. And in fact, and I'm not lying to you, I was paying this woman to teach my son violin. And in fact, she said, if you had prayed this secret prayer, and if you will now learn from me how to pray this secret prayer, God will protect Will from any kind of illness, broken bone, or accident of any kind. And I'm like, wait, what? Oh yeah, she said, and you folks who work in the church, you never believe in the power of secret prayer. I left. Will had 2 minutes of violin instruction. He got back in the car. I was fuming, and I was just saying all kinds of stuff. I said, well, what did you think, Will? And Will just looked at me. He was little, and he said to me, do you think she forgot what happened to Jesus? Bam. Dave reminded us last week that God does not promise anyone immunity from suffering on this earth. No one. No amount of good decisions and clean living can protect any of us from this shared human condition. God does not promise us always that our suffering will make sense now, nor does he promise us that our suffering will all be resolved in a perfect way while we live on this earth. He does not promise us that our suffering will be proportional. I know so many amazing, humble, quiet, good people whose suffering seems off the charts. And some people who could give a rip about any other human beings whose lives are simple and pain-free. Human suffering is a reality in a fallen world, and it is still, at least to me, one of the greatest mysteries of human existence. But this much we do know about suffering. Suffering will come. That's what we know. But I want you to also remember these 4 truths about God's faithfulness when we suffer. The first truth is this: he won't abandon us. He won't abandon us, but sometimes it will feel like he did. Can I get an amen on that? Sometimes it will feel like that. When we suffer, Mark Buchanan writes, it's like God has gone away on a very long trip and he forgot to send a postcard. That's how it feels. And the writers of the Psalms are so very honest about this experience. Psalm 10, verse 1. The psalmist just starts off. He doesn't even greet God. He's just like, why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? This is a universal human feeling. Even Jesus asked the question at the moment of his greatest suffering. He quoted Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? When we suffer, God can feel very far away. But paradoxically, suffering can also be the place where many of us will meet the God of the brokenhearted. As Doug opened us in worship with Psalm 34, verse 18, the scriptures say to us, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves those who are crushed in spirit. I don't know about you, but I need that promise. 20 years ago, when I went through several years of postpartum depression that broke my heart and crushed my spirit, many people asked me after the fact, how did you stay strong enough during that time to hang on to God? And for a long time, I really couldn't answer that question because I knew in my heart that during that time, I was not strong. I was weak. But I realized eventually that I did have an answer. I just told people I wasn't strong enough to hang on to God. But the faithfulness of God meant that didn't matter. See, he was strong enough and he still is strong enough for both of us. And the truth of the matter is that when I suffered, God held on to me, no matter how much my faith in him wavered. The scriptures tell us our weak faith does not nullify God's faithfulness. He knows we are dust. And so God's covenant with his children through Christ is not based on us. Thank God. It's based on the faithfulness of God. He will not abandon us when we suffer. And the second thing we need to remember is that he suffered for us and he suffers with us. The prophet Isaiah describes the Messiah, Jesus, as a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Jesus is never closer to us than when we are suffering. There was a pastor named Edward Shalito in the early 1900s who wrote a poem called Jesus of the Scars as he tried to understand God in the midst of the horrors of World War I. And this is the final stanza of the poem. He writes, "The other gods were strong, but thou was weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds only God's wounds can speak, and not a God has wounds but thou alone." This is unique to the Christian faith. We follow a God who suffered for us and with us. We follow a God who chose the path of suffering as a way to redeem the world. Suffering is the way that God turned evil back on itself. Suffering is the means by which God conquered death and sin. And so we have to remember when we face suffering, we are on holy ground. Ground we would never choose for ourselves. Ground we never want to be on. But when we are on it, we must remember that Jesus is never closer to us than there. When we suffer, God will not abandon us. And he suffers with us. And he's faithful to us through others, through other people. We just read this in the book of Romans, in the daily scriptures. Paul wrote, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, and mourn with those who mourn." I love that. See, we're not called as Christians to be stoic or trite in the midst of human suffering. We're not called to superficially frost over pain and quote Bible verses out of context to suffering people. We are to mourn with those who mourn. This is one of the most beautiful ways that God is faithful to us. He gives us to each other. And so we need to come right alongside our suffering friends, our brothers and sisters and family, and we need to mourn with them. And then eventually, at the right time, when we have wept our tears with each other, then we can turn in wisdom and kindness and with a fierce determination, and we can say to each other, do not lose hope. Do not lose faith. Do not lose heart. Paul writes, I love this, to the church at Corinth, 2 Corinthians 4. Therefore, he says, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us eternal glory that far outweighs them all. See, we need other people to remind us that God is with us when we suffer. And God did that for me. Late one night in the pediatric intensive care unit in the hospital where my niece was, When you're in those moments, it's hard to think and it's hard to pray and it's hard to say and do all the right things. But the one thing I could feel in my spirit was the question, where are you, God? Where are you? And so one night I was leaving the room, my niece was in, and I don't know, probably going to the bathroom or something. And a woman passed me, an African-American woman. She was wearing a hospital robe, I think, because she was using it to sleep in. And she looked at me, and she stopped me, and she said, "Is that your baby in there?" And I said, "No, it's my sister's baby." And she said, "I just want you to know that God is in that room." And she said, "So when I walk by, you're going to see me hold my hand out like that. I didn't want you to think I was a weirdo. I just want you to know that I feel him in there. And so I'm holding out my hand to touch him and also to pray for your baby." And I felt like I said to her, you are an angel to me right now, because I didn't know where God was. God is faithful to us through each other. And God is faithful to us in one final way. In the end, through Christ, he will bring us home. In the big, 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 big end. Do you know what I'm talking about? The big end. In the end, the only definitive answer to suffering and the ultimate way that God is faithful to his children is that he promises to bring us home to himself. And he will wipe away every tear. And he will welcome us to a place where there is no death or mourning or crying or pain. For as John wrote in the book of Revelation, the old order of things will have passed away. And it is so important for Christians to remember in times of suffering that our faith hinges on, it hangs on, it hopes in the resurrection. Again, Timothy Keller writes, "The Christian doctrine of the resurrection and the renewal of the world means that you and I do not merely receive a consolation for the life we have lost through suffering and death, but we receive a restoration of it. We not only get the bodies and the lives we had before we died in Christ, but we get the bodies and lives we wished for, but never before received. We will get a glorious, perfect, unimaginably rich life in a renewed material world." That is our faith, my friends. And through the centuries, great writers have tried to put this into words. C.S. Lewis said, "Heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even our agony into glory." And J.R.R. Tolkien envisions a time, he says, in which everything sad is going to come untrue. I love that. Jesus used his own suffering to conquer suffering, so that in the end, when he calls us home, our suffering will not only end, but it will be turned into something glorious beyond our wildest hope. And so, as my family watches my niece go through a grueling rehabilitation process, we have great earthly hope that her body, mind, and spirit will be revived, and that she will live a long and full and happy life and live for years to call my husband Chuckling Chuck. But our ultimate hope doesn't lie there, you see. Our ultimate hope is that in the big end, God will turn this momentary season of suffering and sorrow and loss into a glory beyond our wildest imagination. This is the truth upon which everything hinges. And it is the only reason that you and I can sing, even on our darkest days. So sometimes, I believe this with my whole heart, God arranges circumstances because he has something to say to a group of people, or maybe to specific individuals. I don't claim to know exactly what he's doing. And I believe he has done that for us this morning. Allie Rogers, who was raised here at Orchard and is a beautiful singer-songwriter, just happened to be in town this weekend and just happened to have co-written a beautiful song that completes what I have so unartfully been trying to say this morning. And so, as Allie sings, I want to just say to you, if you are in the midst of hard times this morning, or if you've ever begged God for the strength to get out of bed and to keep going, or to have a reason to sing, I believe God wants you to hear these words this morning. And so I hope you'll just accept this moment as a gift from God to you.
When the pieces seem to shatter together off the floor, and all that seems to matter is I don't feel you anymore. I don't feel you anymore. No, I need a reason to sing. I need a reason to sing. I need to know that you're still holding the whole world in your hands. I need a reason to sing. When I'm overcome by fear and I hate everything I know, if this waiting lasts forever, I'm afraid I might let go. I'm afraid I might let go. Oh, I need a reason to sing. I need a reason to sing. I need to know that you're still holding the whole world in your hands. I need a reason to sing. Oh yeah, yeah. Will there be a victory? Will you sing it over me now? Your peace is a melody. Will you sing it over me now? Oh, will there be a victory? Will you sing it over me now? Sing it over me now, 'cause I need a reason to sing. I need a reason to sing. I need to know that you're still holding the whole world in your hands. That is a reason to sing. So I will sing, sing, sing to my God, my King, for all for you've been good always. I will sing, sing, sing to my God, my King, for all else fades away. And I will love, love, love with this heart you've made, for you've been good always, for you've been good always.
That's so true. Thank you. When I forget what my reason to sing is, I fall back on this quote from the famous preacher Spurgeon, who said, God is too good to be unkind, and he's too wise to be mistaken. And so in your life, when you cannot trace his hand and figure out what he's doing when you suffer, what you have to do is trust his heart. And his heart toward you is good. So would you join me? Stand, please. And as Christians, remember that you sing because you know that God through Christ holds the whole world in his hands. Let's continue to worship.